So, and also, so Professor, it's a very great honor for me to chair this first session on the conference on capitalism. The first session is on capitalism in transition, which means how capitalism is changing with globalization. And here we have very distinguished speakers, a great, and also a great friend of mine, which is Enzo Mingione. The speakers are Professor Saskia Sassen, Robert Lind, Professor of Sociology, and co-chairs in the Committee of Global Thought at Columbia University. Then we have Simone Ghezzi, Assistant Professor in Economic Anthropology in the University of Milan Bicocca. Enzo Mingione, he is not necessary to introduce him any longer. And so, as it has been asked me by the organizers, I just introduce very briefly the session. Then the speakers will have about 5-10 minutes to illustrate their contribution. And then there will be two discussants, Professor Francesco Ramella from the University of Turin and Professor Serafino Negrelli from the University of Bicocca. They'll have about 10-15 minutes to to make their comments, and there will be a second round where you can answer and illustrate better your argument if it is necessary. Now, I think that the interpretative key, which more or less openly lies behind the different contributions that will be presented now, is a Polanyian perspective, especially the theory of the double movement and the shifting dynamics through which social and economic relations are embedded, disembedded, re-embedded. All the three movements are, the first, how they were embedded, how now are they disembedded, and how they can be re-embedded, will be discussed here for you. Saskia Sassen focuses on the growth of employment-based insecurity and poverty that has been dramatically qualifying the organization of economic activity in the vast service economies over the last 20 years. Her starting point is a question, very clear question. We see, of course, she will explain this. To what extent are employment-based economic insecurity and poverty intrinsic to advanced economies rather than deviation, as so much policy discussion seems to suggest? This is a very, 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 very important point, starting point. And so, rather than on narratives of individuals' failings, she focuses on the outcomes. She discusses this insecurity and poverty as outcomes of the growth of new sectors, specialized services and finance, allowing on the one side super profits and fostering on the other side the development of labor-intensive low-wage sector, which means sharp increase in socioeconomics and spatial inequalities. And these tendencies are related to the mutually reinforcing dynamic emerging from the decline of citizenship systems that had developed in the so-called 30 Glorious or in the 40th stage. In other terms, in Polanyian terms, is a clear dynamic of disembeddedness. While Simone Ghezzi, who is an economic anthropologist, openly focuses on a reconceptualization of the term embeddedness as a social disembedding of the economy. But he draws, and he will explain to us, during his fieldwork on micro-entrepreneurial settings and informal work in a local context, he shows how the market, because of its own logical competitiveness, is a disorganizer of social life. So the current disembedding processes produce chronically unstable arrangements. And while in the past there was, we can say, a situation of embeddedness, which means the informal social protection beneficially matches the paternalistic exploitation, now weakening reciprocity plus the lack of institutional safety safety nets results in a new forms of precariousness. While finally, Enzo Mingione, in his contribution, whose title is clearly The Double Movement and the Perspective of Contemporary Capitalism, uses Polanyi's framework to interpret contemporary social change. His focus is on the double movement and the dialectic between the destruction of social relations by the disembedding forces of the market and the creation of new social relations and institutions through re-embedding processes. He also complements in an original way Polanyi with Marshall, and from what is very important from my point of view personally, I must say, is that he identifies emancipatory tendencies to construct new forms of solidarity and protection in an increasingly heterogeneous and destandardized, fragmented, and unstable society, which means a process of re-embeddedness. But of course, he will explain better, but his analysis at the end is a bit pessimistic. But from my point of view, it is very important that he focuses also on these attempts to, from new actors, new agencies, new institutions to counter the evident, the patent tendencies toward disembeddedness in an attempt which is not very perhaps not very successful, but anyway, in an attempt to open new perspectives. Anyway, now I spoke too much. Better I give the floor now to Professor Saskia Sassen, and she will say much better than what I give.
Well, è un grande piacere per me essere qui, parlerò in inglese, no? Devo parlare in inglese, ma non resisto, diciamo, con questo accento argentino che ho in italiano, allora come non si fa? Ma è veramente bellissimo essere qui tutti per celebrare a Mingione. I think that in my career, if we use that term, I don't know what other term to use, I can't quite say in my life. So in my career, Enzo Mingione, also in my life eventually, the good food and all of that. But Enzo Mingione was actually one of the first sort of professors who sort of recognized Ian and Martinotti, of course. So Italy was actually very important to me. Now, I have very little time, and so I want to talk about what I see as an emergent trend, and I really appreciate your introduction, a trend that is sort of embedded. It doesn't stand out there saying, I'm new. No. It is actually embedded in the system. It's quite invisible. And one way of formulating it is to say that we're really dealing with an epoch when extractive logics are becoming very influential. They have major impacts, no matter their invisibility. So for instance, just to give a simple example, the traditional bank is commerce. It sells something it has, money. It's commerce, it's okay. Finance, high finance, sells something it does not have. And in selling what it does not have, it has to actually extract values that it then packages in its own mode, scales up the values, and sells. So when you begin to look at our current period, and you try to, it's like a process of discovering, it's like being a detective. Where do I actually see extractive logics? Think Google, or even better example, Facebook. They never lose. They're never fined. They may publish data that is not that is false. Doesn't matter. They make the money. Once they have the platforms are brilliant, brilliant forms of knowledge. Once they have the platform, they just sit and receive. When you compare that to what it takes to set up a little small business, like a family business. I'm just putting those two contrasts. Now, I must say that I also have found myself, this now is I've been at it for, I feel like a century, not quite, but anyhow, close. I see that in retrospective, the last 30 years, I've been a bit of a rebel. I just like to mention the fact that my first book got rejected by 12 publishers, and I kept sending it out. I said, finally, somebody will publish it. Well, they did. But that just gives you a sense of how I was off the mode. I really am in the zone of before method. And before method is the space you can discover. And part of the discovering, of course, means that you're free to read an extraordinary breadth of materials, some of which might not be pertinent, but in that process also I got to read a lot of, my family was living in Italy at the time, a lot of sort of Italian scholarship. So I think in many ways I was shaped by Italy. I also tried university in Italy. That didn't work out very well, for various reasons. And so some of these analytic tactics, I find myself thinking the need to actively destabilize stabilized meanings. What is the economy today? What is the middle classes today? What is the national government today? It is something that doesn't quite fit in what it was, 30 years ago. Really before the 1980s is one clear way of putting it. The 1980s, a time when we globalized in a certain way. We have had globalization for a very long time. When we privatize, when we give firms a lot of power. The United States is a very extreme case. It's not the only extreme case, though. And so, and part of that then is powerful explanation, very important. I want to see what, the stronger that powerful explanation is, what don't I see? It's like circle of light in a dark night. The stronger that light, the more you see everything inside the zone, in this case, standard issue, whatever, and the less you can see what is in the penumbra around it. Territory, as some of you might know, to me is an extraordinarily significant category because, when you look at the territorial, which to me is not just simply land, terrain, ground, the territorial has embedded logics of power, of enablement, et cetera, and when you look at how the territorial has shifted, it's like one way of understanding a lot of histories, histories across centuries. Expulsions is something that I want to briefly touch on. I think that is one of the markers of this very current period. And what I mean by expulsions is the fact of a sort of set of systemic edges inside national territories. When those edges are crossed, our conceptual categories do not allow us to capture what is happening. Very simple examples. Long-term unemployment. After a bit, certainly in a country like the United States, maybe Italy is much better than the US is. Not too much. After a certain point, you become invisible, not to the eyes, your body is still there, but you become invisible to the categories through which we measure and establish, us. Hello. And the other one for me is dead land. In its full physicality, like the body of the unemployed, in its full physicality, it becomes invisible to our conceptual categories. Same thing with dead land. Now, Europe is much better about land than Russia or the United States and such countries are. But once land is dead, it is as if it didn't exist. And the question then also becomes, what do governments like the US government, like the Russia government, actually govern in terms of their actual territorial condition in the simplest term of that sense, territorial? So, and then finally, just very, very briefly, I want to emphasize in what I say next, the making of something. The making of something is very partial because clearly there are many other factors that are involved in an outcome, not just the making of it, right? But this is just, and so I like this, we make, I'm not talking about the makers movement, but we make. So I'm very impressed. We managed to destroy in 20 years one of the biggest internal seas, the Aral Sea. That's an accomplishment. We tend to think of capabilities, as 100% positive. I really think we need to expand that variable and say, it goes from bad to good. And this is even more impressive. It also took us very little time to destroy 1 billion years. When you begin to look at us this way, then you begin to say, wow, we have power. We misused it. And so it's like a way of, of expanding the notion of we make. It's not just whatever, some abstract powers that make. It's also we. And I mean it, actually, I want to get at some positive here in that sense. Now here is something I'm not going to dwell on, but so just a third little element here. The first being the question of method, the second one being this capacity of making disastrous outcomes, is where are we at right now? And so I want to get at this notion of an extractive logic. And one framing that we can use, I love this framing, is what is the steam engine of our epoch? The steam engine didn't change everything, but it changed enough to make a difference. And frankly, I think that is how we need to think about change in the significant and consequential way in which change can happen. It's not that it changes everything. Once I've said it's not about what changes everything, you know, you can really move into these deeper logics that might be quite invisible and that might be very partial in their effects, but by God, they can make a difference, because change, foundational change, does not require that everything changes. And one very simple way of putting it is what is in and what is out. Now, in a way, I like to mention an example that sort of comes from old England, you know, in England. So if you had a little plane, at the time when the factories were already in the big cities in Manchester, if you could have gone with a little plane over that part of England, there was no plane at that point, you would have said, what a nice rural economy. And on top of the hill, there were the sheep. Well, those sheep were no longer in that circuit. They were already in a completely different circle that didn't have anything to do with the rural, if we separate the rural as a specific condition. So again, profound change may be happening. Do we see it? You know, what is it that we can actually see? I think I'm going to skip this, but just one very quick example. So one of the things that I'm looking at under extractive logics is high finance, which I describe, and I hope I don't offend any of the high-level financiers in the audience. Hi, where are you actually? Can I, yeah, I assume there is nobody like that here. But so finance to me, as I said, is an extractive sector. And this is just one little bit of finance, and I just want to point out a curve of growth. So that was less than $1 trillion in 2001, and 5 years later, 62 trillion. Think of anything that can have that rate of growth. I checked it out, nothing. Now those 62 trillion at that point was quite a bit actually. Global GDP was much lower than that. It's quite interesting to see that value of finance, which tells you also immediately it's not about money. Finance is not about money. The total value of finance in that same year, 2007, that's when the crash happens, was something like 600 trillion. That was much more than global GDP. And when you look at the value today of finance, it's over a quadrillion. That's more zeros. You know, we're talking lots of zeros. They're all working zeros, they are, but it's a lot of zeros. So over a quadrillion, global GDP in the world, as you all know, is well under 100 trillion. Now, global GDP is a specific kind of measure, but it tells you that finance is something that we cannot think of in terms of money. If you look at the currencies issued by all the central banks in the world, it's about 400 trillion. It's a very wobbly measure, because currencies go up and down, certainly in most countries in the world, wildly up and down. But so it just gives you a sense, and so I argue finance has to be thought as a capability. And again, capability, you know, as a spectrum. In this case, a very negative one, a very dangerous one. Now, I wanted to get very quickly, this is all kinds of incredibly interesting stuff, but I'm going to skip. Now, I want to mention the case. Some of you are familiar, so I can speak in shorthand. I'm looking at my clock. When I look like that, it's because I have the clock. I'm terrorized by clocks. I don't function well with clocks. But so we had a case where in a period of 7 years, over 16 million contracts to buy houses, basically. I exaggerate a bit. It was also some other kinds of buildings. were executed, mostly with people who were fairly low income. 14.5 million of those households, which could be up to 30 million people, lost their homes in a very short period of time. When you look at it that way, finance is brilliant, brilliant people. They are not about to develop an instrument that is going to mean that most of the buyers of the instrument go broke. That doesn't work, right? This was not about housing. This was about getting materialities. Like one should really think about it, a vast field where you throw in those 16 million houses in order to generate asset, materiality. It could be a toilet, it could be a wall, it could be, it wasn't about the house. Generate an instrument, asset-backed security for the high-level financial circuit. Because a high-level financial circuit had it with derivatives. A derivative is a value derived from another value, That's good for us. But that's not good for the high level. They wanted asset-backed securities. So suddenly, in a few years, 14.5 million households lost their homes. That could be, I repeat, 30 million people, 40 million people. This story was invisible. It was invisible. Can you imagine? My country, I'm Dutch, 16 million people is the total population of that country. If we add the tourists, maybe we have twice as much, but still, So what is it? What is it that we see and what is it that we do not see? And the way in which the material actually is not always speech. Speech in the sense that here I am, this is what it is, because it so often is invisible. This instrument has entered Europe, and the biggest numbers are in Germany, a country where over half the population actually rents. And this is something else I'm going to skip. I just want to, this and then one more. Do I have 2 more minutes? So extractive sectors, such as high finance, can extract even from modest households. That is different from what it used to be. It used to be that you only dealt with. Today, when you stop thinking about it like individual little houses, and the deceit, the misrepresentation, this is a mortgage. It was not a mortgage. It was a way of putting it all in together. Now, here is yet another extractive mode, and this is something that I have written about under the title, Who Owns the City? And I'm just looking at the top 100 cities in the world as measured by the amount of buying of property. We're talking big buy, minimum $5 million, something like that, both national and foreign. So this is yearly. This is just one little slice, one little case, this particular set of issues that I'm going to talk about now, of a much broader spectrum of buying, acquisitions, investments. So it's just one thing, but it's one thing that has popped up very strongly and is a bit disastrous for notions of the city as urbanity, rather than the city simply as a collection of buildings. So again, this is 1 year just buying existing property, 55 billion for New York, London you can see, etc., right? And if you look at foreign investment, London is definitely number one. I love Amsterdam there, and the figures, the growth rates, they are basically all positive, even when they show negative. That number is what it is compared to the year before. So London and New York, already so much had been bought that compared to the prior year, it was not that much of a difference. Look at Amsterdam, 248%. I don't know what they're buying. I mean, Amsterdam is not very big, but anyhow, there it is. So that had one of the biggest. If you look at the top 100, you have cities like some cities in China, like Shenzhen. There is Shenzhen, 426. Why? Because Beijing and Shanghai and Nanjing already are very highly bought, and so Shenzhen appears as a big deal. Oh, this is in Spanish, not in Italian. I'm sorry. So here, the total value of these acquisitions from 2014 to 2015 was 600 billions. From 2015 to 2016, that's the latest figures we have, more than $1 trillion. It's going up. I have to conclude. So the top 100 cities in the world by property investment, and note is investment, account for 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world GDP, and 76% of property investment. Investment here means it's been financialized. I finish with a last figure and a last comment. According to Saville, who takes all the buildings that have been sort of financialized, that is 217 trillion. That is more than global GDP, I repeat, that's just buildings. Now here, one image that I want to leave you with. When you see, in lower Manhattan especially, that's the most extreme case, big towers, newly built or old towers, but high level, high price, half completely empty or half empty. This is very common now in Manhattan. People think, oh my God, poor investors. They lost all that value. Nobody's renting, nobody's buying. No. And this is very significant for the future of urbanity, I would say. They're making more money by using those towers to construct an asset-backed security. It started with the little homes, they've done that, and now they're into the towers. So, because when that's a financialized building, they can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell in the high-level financial circuit. You know, every day they can do it 15 times. That is what explains 217 trillion. That has nothing to do with the value of the property. That has to do with the financializing of the property, that then moves. I'm done. Thank you. No. Oh.
Thank you very much for your exercise in trying to destabilize this received wisdom and the stable. Well, now I give the floor to Simone Ghezzi, who, well, he will say what he will speak about.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for the organizer for having invited me and having asked me to contribute to this very interesting publication. It was a very honor for me to do this. Well, I would like to bring you back to a smaller scale situation. I was one of the students of Enzo that in the early 1990s graduated with him, and here and David Benassi, Alberta Andreotti, and Jurek Katz have already explained, give us an idea of what was that period like. To a certain extent, I represent the anthropological side of Enzo, because Enzo in his books was always open to many ancillary disciplines, and sociology and anthropology and social anthropology was one of those disciplines. And I was very much interested in fragmented societies. I just want to tell you a little anecdote about that, because when I went to Enzo's office and asked him if he was available to have to cherish my work and my thesis, we discussed about the topic, and we ended up talking about the informal economy. And he said, you know, I have a recent book that is going to be published, and maybe you want to start with this book. And it was Fragmented Societies, and it was a very bulky volume. And those of you who have read the book knows that it was 500 page long. And I don't know if it was the first student to read the book before engaging on the thesis. And that's where basically my research, my interest in anthropology started. By the way, Enzo had dialogues with many anthropologists along his career. I could mention Larissa Lomnitz, Gavin Smith, who could not be today, but he was one of the long friends of Enzo, Jonathan Friedman, Susan Narodsky, to name but a few. So I see how, and I want to come back to my contribution to this book. I want to see how there could be a potentially collaborative approach, both methodological and empirical, with the sociological thought that Enzo has developed throughout his years. And to a certain extent, to all the new economic sociology which he contributed to develop. And in particular, the idea of deconstructing the market and produce a non-econocentric interpretation of it. For example, as was mentioned earlier, the market as a disorganizer of social life and not self-regulating mechanism, and it's institution that cannot be populated by atomized individuals, and basically a source of social tensions. Okay, so and I think this was, now that we tend to take for granted these conceptualizations right now, but 30 years ago they were not part of current debate in sociology. It was the new economic sociology that brought up these issues more permanently forward. So at that time, I also got in touch with Polanyi's thought, and because I was actually very important in Enzo's work in fragmented societies, and Enzo's revisiting of Polanyi analytical approach, as to me it became it was a way to see how there could be a methodological compatibility between sociology and anthropology, and to develop also a theoretical base for critical thinking about Western capitalism, for example. And he's interested in informal economy, in household labor, in people's strategies of survival, seen as institutionalized forms of sociality based on the reciprocity and redistributions, has given consistency to the Polanyian notion of embeddedness. So, and that's the other major category that I described in my contribution, and I used the term metaphor, metaphor in terms of our way of seeing how how the theorization of the self-regulated market could be used to understand better to understand and to interpret the complexity of the market. So my argument in the article is that there's a renewed interest in the concept of embeddedness, and scholars like Mingione, Zelizer, Laville, Swedberg, and many others contribute to create this possibility of creating common grounds between between social anthropology and sociology, and especially among certain kind of cultural aspect of economic institutions that were very interesting and could be easily debated between these two disciplines. So this new interest in the market became also important for me through ethnographic investigation. So that's basically what I was trying to do. So this convergence of interest between the market among the economic sociologists and economic anthropologists allow me to develop this research in a micro setting. In particular, try to provide a thick description of the social embeddedness in the economy in areas where sociology normally cannot reach, because normally ethnography is a method that is dear to anthropologists more than in sociology. So it is true that this argument was a reminiscence of the old debate between substantivists and formalists in anthropology, which faded away without resolving any moot points that he had raised in the past, in the late 60s and early 70s. Yet in retrospect, the new economic sociology renewed interest in Polanyi's category, proved with hindsight that substantivists and economic sociologists of the new generation had methodological and theological affinities. So, and in the second part of my contribution, try to put into practice these ideas. So we have the concept of market. We have some tools to interpret the market, like embeddedness or disembeddedness. We have the double movements of those Polanyian categories. And the second part of my chapter, I try to show how we could use these tools, analytical tools, to understand, to interpret what has been changing in a small settings. In my case, in the situation where small enterprises are working in a society, in a thick society, in small urban centers, and are creating social relationships with the suppliers, with the workers, and with the institutions and at the local level. So in my second part of my contribution is basically ethnographic, and I provide some examples of embeddedness and disembeddedness, and maybe during the discussion I could go into details about these aspects. What I would like to conclude, I would like to conclude by saying that doing research, like a small-scale research, could create some difficulties because you lose the overall aspect of the dynamics between the small scale dynamics and the larger scales relationships, the global and the local, for example. But the work that Enzo has produced has helped me to place my work into a global context very easily. And the second thing I would like to say is that by doing research at such a small scale, you also notice another thing, how fast things change, and how it is very different from when I started fieldwork in the early 1990s. Things are changing much faster now, and these dynamics of disembedment and embedment in society are quite frequent. I mean, the system is so highly dynamic that it is very difficult to keep track of everything if you, for example, lose the ground of this kind of methodology and you don't try to develop, to continue with this research, and that's what I'm doing. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff about the my findings in the small small scales, but I think I might bring up all these findings later on when we have the discussion with the discussant. Okay, okay, thanks.
Thank you very much to Simone Ghezzi. I liked very much in his chapter, because I read it, I had the possibility of reading it. I liked very much the second part on small case analysis, because especially because now I'm working on how employment relations are regulated within small firms. And what you said about the changes regarding this is really very enlightening. Now I give the floor to Enzo Mingione.
Thank you. Allow me to begin by thanking everybody, the participants, particularly the one that contributed to the book, and the organizers of the book. They did a surprise gift, which is very important for every some sort of scholar and intellectual. So I'm very grateful to them. So I will try to fulfill your expectation, perhaps, but this is very difficult, and but mainly to open a ground for discussion, because this is important. I think I have adopted some sort of a Polanyian approach, which is I have always some sort of refused to discuss with a true Polanyian, because they would raise a lot of objections, and I thought this Polanyian approach is open, and it is some sort of, it has some signals in order to understand some sort of what Polanyi called market society, and that we call capitalism. I think that the idea that the new some sort of market occasion, so the commodification process, which concerns the modern world, modernity, the industrialization, and concerns all the global world today, and this is important to say. There are very few areas so remote and abandoned that don't have some sort of, are not exposed to commodification process. The idea that the commodification process is a disorganizer of social life is very powerful, and give you some sort of a means of understanding the dynamic of social change, and not some sort of only some sort of a static analysis of a small case, which is, we have to work empirically on a small case, but we have to put it in a frame which is dynamic and global. And this is what according to me, is possible through the double movement. And I have recently some sort of revived the idea that, yes, you have the double movement, and I'm grateful to Ida to have raised this point, and we have to think at the double movement as also has a possible emancipation process, because this is very important. It does not disorganize only, it also opens the necessity to reorganize, and this disorganization and reorganizations are leading to some sort of new social bonds, which are always some sort of a little bit oppressive, but less oppressive or differently oppressive than the past, and this means that some sort of the double market is some sort of producing some sort of emancipation. More so because the double movement opens some sort of an individualization process, which means that people become agent of some sort of building the new society, and building some sort of opposition to oppression. So this is the other part. This happens in different contexts, in different way. This may not happen. This may not happen because commodification can be imposed and can be violently imposed on some population, and this population are not at all emancipated. And this is what happened to the majority of the world, which are eradicated from their oppressive traditional societies, like Marx already thought that, but they are not put into a better situation or a good situation or a livable situation. They are put into new plantations, new shanty towns, impossible condition of lives, and very hard way of having some sort of a new identity and a new free identity. So this is this process is a good tool. The idea of taking this is a good tool to understand what is happening in societies in dynamic and global terms. And this is why I would like to you to think about adopting this frame. Then I'll come briefly to the analysis of what is happening now to Western capitalism, which is the title of the book, and how you can use this tool to understand the perspectives, which are some sort of to understand what may happen, but it may happen in a different way, because it is the action of people is always unpredictable. We don't know if somebody will make a war, some financier will destroy the money, if some investment will go very badly, and all this kind of thing, and what will happen in the very powerful financial process. So I'm saying two things in order to go toward the conclusion. One thing is we are accustomed to start thinking a little bit non-dynamic and anthrocentric from what has been the great experience of the democratic welfare capitalist age in the afterward periods. The democratic welfare capitalist age, where as Marshall is reminding us, but he has been totally forgotten in that, was built by some sort of the use of abundant resources due to the fact that the Western world had a control and a government of capitalism, while the decolonizing countries were left to this non-emancipatory commodification process. They had resources to combine some sort of welfare, democracy, and capitalism that are not combinable. That in a normal time with normal resources are not combinable. And they did this by some sort of what Marshall says, legitimizing inequalities. They did this by legitimizing inequalities, but Marshall says, look, they don't take a point. What is the level of inequalities that can be legitimized? And if it raises this level, what happens when it is no longer legitimizable? And here we are. Here we are. This is the article by Marshall, is 1972. So a very long time passed, and now it is clear that there are, in the Western countries, there is no longer enough emancipation. People are fragmented and abandoned, and they have a lot of difficulties in building new social bonds, and at the same time, some sort of inequalities are widening, and there is no possibility to govern this process and to legitimize the level of inequalities. This is why I may sound pessimistic, and other sound pessimistic, because at the end of the chapter I quote Wolfgang Streeck, who is very pessimistic, and our colleagues here, he may correct himself sometimes, but he is usually very pessimistic. Well, I think we have to be a little bit pessimistic because this is the reality, but at the same time we have to be a little bit optimistic because in a way it is up to us to build a response to what is some sort of a society which is more fragmented, more unequal, less social, and it is up to us to build some sort of forms of commodification that are some sort of sociable, and it is up to us, and that is my last point, at the urban and local point. The most of the population of the world is living in cities, and it is in cities that the agency produces something new, and it is there that we have to look if we want to be a little bit optimistic. And this is not, and I think this is not too much, because if you think at the bourgeois revolution and the industrial revolution, at the commodification revolution, this started in cities. And it was what Wolfgang Streeck would call a very limited phenomenon. And from this very limited phenomenon, the motor of the double movement built up the modern societies. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Enzo. And now let's the floor to our discussant. I don't know, do you want Francesco Ramelli wants to be the first, or Serafino Negrelli, as you prefer?
Okay,
Okay, you, yes.
Okay, thank you very much